He was the Cane King, the iron-fisted ruler of the Korean underworld. Tonight was his 60th birthday, the night that God of Seoul would name his successor. The air in the golden banquet was heavy with the scent of expensive cigars and the stifling silence of terror. Men who controlled nations were afraid to exhale. Then, the heavy oak doors swung open. It wasn't an assassin. It wasn't a rival boss. It was a woman in a simple white dress, a ghost in a sea of black suits. She walked directly into the kill zone, the space where no one survives without a nod from the king. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a battered silver watch, a relic from a blood-soaked past he thought he had buried. When she spoke, her voice didn't shake. She uttered a single sentence that stripped away his divinity and brought the entire Yoon syndicate to its knees. What did she say to make a monster tremble? And how does a pocket watch hold the power to dismantle an empire? Stay tuned. This isn't a celebration, it's an execution of a legacy. The Golden Banquet wasn't just a gala, it was a fortress of absolute sovereignty. Held in a marble hall where the walls were thick enough to muffle screams, it was a place where senators and titans of industry felt privileged to bow. But everyone in that room knew who held the true leash. Yoon Kaesung. Kaesung stood at the center like a statue carved from ancient basalt. His long black coat swept the floor, and his hand gripped a heavy cane, a symbol of 1,000 broken spirits. His eyes were unblinking, radiating a cold, predatory authority. He was the old-world definition of power, a man whose name was synonymous with a body count that stretched back decades. And then there was Ha-yeol. In this room of predators, she appeared fragile, yet she was the only one truly armed. Having lived in exile, as a human rights lawyer, she was the moral antithesis of everything her father built. Her white dress was her armor, her steady posture was her weapon. She didn't need the Mafia's guns because she possessed the one thing Kaesung couldn't kill, the truth. She hadn't come for an inheritance, she had come to pay a debt. The golden elevator doors slid open with a hiss, revealing the sprawling, minimalist penthouse of Kaesung, the man the underworld whispered of as the Cane King. He didn't look like a monarch of the shadows, he looked like a god of industry. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seoul skyline bleeding neon across his sharp features. In his right hand, he held a black, obsidian-topped cane, not for support, but for authority. Before him knelt a man whose breathing was a ragged, wet sound against the marble floor. He had skimmed from the gala's logistics fund, thinking a few missing zeros would vanish in the excess. He was wrong. Kaesung didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at the man. He simply tapped the ferrule of his cane against the floor. The sound was like a heartbeat. The gala is a symphony, Kaesung said, his voice a low, melodic baritone. Every guest is a note. Every flower is a rest. You, however, are a dissonance. The man began to plead, his words tripping over themselves, but Kaesung moved with a sudden, fluid violence that defied his composed exterior. The cane swung in a blur of motion, the obsidian head connecting with the man's shoulder with a sickening crack. There was no wasted energy, just brutal, surgical efficiency. The man collapsed, silenced by the sheer speed of the strike. Clean this up, Kaesung instructed a shadow in the corner. The gala begins in 3 hours. I want the smell of copper replaced with the scent of lilies and expensive gin. He turned back to the window, the violence already forgotten. His mind was a map of the evening ahead. The gala wasn't just a party, it was a hunting ground. High society donors, corrupt politicians, and rivals would all be under one roof. He adjusted his silk cufflinks, the movement precise. Everything was prepared, the security detail was invisible, the champagne was chilled to exactly 8 degrees Celsius, and the traps were set. He picked up a white orchid from a nearby vase, spinning it between his fingers before crushing it slowly. The petals fell like snow. Kaesung caught his reflection in the glass, a man of absolute control, ready to welcome the world into his web. The Cane King was ready for his guests. The heavy oak door didn't just open, it yielded, as if the very air in the room had stepped aside to make way for her. Ha-Yol stood in the threshold, her presence a sudden, sharp intake of breath in a room that had finally begun to exhale. She didn't offer an apology for the interruption, nor did she seek permission to enter. She simply existed there, a silent gale that chilled the warmth of the previous moment. The psychological shift was instantaneous. The soft, amber glow of the hearth seemed to dim, or perhaps it was just that Ha-Yol's shadow stretched longer, darker, across the floorboards. Min-Jun felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a physical manifestation of the invisible walls she brought with her. The casual laughter that had been bubbling between the guests died mid-air, replaced by the brittle silence of people suddenly aware of their own posture. She moved into the room with a grace that was as beautiful as it was predatory. Her eyes, cool and discerning, swept over the faces present, lingering just a second too long on each to be considered polite. It was a silent audit, a cataloging of weaknesses and alliances. When her gaze finally settled on Min-Jun, he felt the weight of years of unspoken expectations pressing down on him. "I see the celebration started without the guest of honor," she said, her voice a low, melodic contrast to the tension vibrating in the air. It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. The space between them, which had felt intimate and safe only moments before, was now a stage. Every movement felt rehearsed, every glance a calculated risk. The uninvited guest hadn't just arrived, she had reclaimed the room, turning their sanctuary into her court. The air grew heavy with the scent of her perfume, bitter orange and cold rain, and Min-Jun realized with a sinking heart that the evening was no longer theirs to control. Ha-Yol placed the velvet-lined box on the mahogany table, the click of the latch echoing like a gunshot in the silent study. Inside sat the silver ghost. It was a pocket watch of haunting craftsmanship, its casing etched with sprawling vines that seemed to shiver under the dim chandelier light. Unlike the polished treasures typically associated with the Yun family, this piece bore the faint, stubborn scuffs of a history that hadn't been sanitized by publicists. "My grandfather always told the press that the empire began with a visionary loan and a stroke of genius," Ha-Yol began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. She opened the casing. Instead of a ticking second hand, the interior revealed a hollowed-out compartment containing a jagged, blood-stained sliver of a ledger page. She looked up, meeting the eyes of those who had spent their lives worshipping the Yun name. It wasn't a loan. It was a betrayal. The silver ghost wasn't a gift of appreciation from a business partner, it was the only thing my grandfather left his commanding officer after reporting him for a crime he didn't commit. The air in the room grew heavy, the weight of the revelation pressing down on the polished floorboards. Ha-Yol traced the initials scratched into the inner lid, not Y, but S. The true architect of the family's logistics network hadn't been a Yun at all, but a man named Shin who had died in a military prison while Ha-Yol's grandfather used Shin's stolen blueprints to build the first warehouses. "The empire wasn't built on a foundation of gold," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the tarnished silver. "It was built on silence and a stolen watch. We've been living in a house of cards constructed from another man's life." As the truth settled into the bones of the room, the watch seemed to pulse with a cold, rhythmic energy. The legacy wasn't a triumph, it was a debt that had been compounding for 3 generations, and the interest was finally due. Ha-Yol felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The myth was dead, and for the first time, she could breathe in the ruins of the family's lies. The flashbulbs felt like physical blows, each one a sharp, white needle pricking at the edges of Kaisung's vision. He stood at the center of the gallery, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of chilled champagne. To the public, he was the untouchable prodigy, a man carved from marble. But tonight, the marble was beginning to spiderweb with fine, jagged lines. Across the room, Minho leaned against a pillar, his gaze heavy with a knowing, predatory amusement. He didn't look away when Kaisung caught his eye, instead, he raised his glass in a mock toast. Kaisung felt the familiar prickle of sweat at his hairline. His fingers, usually so steady they could trace a line of ink thinner than a hair, trembled as he reached for a glass of water. "You look pale, Kaisung," a voice drifted from his left. It was Ji-won, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "The pressure of perfection is a heavy crown, isn't it? One might almost think you're human after all." Kaisung forced a laugh, but the sound was brittle, echoing in his chest like glass breaking in an empty room. "Innovation requires energy, Ji-won. Something you wouldn't understand, sticking to the safe shadows of tradition." He tried to turn away, to maintain the practiced gait of a victor, but his knees felt strangely hollow. The room began to tilt. The murmurs of the crowd, once a soothing hum of adoration, now sounded like the buzzing of flies. He could see them watching, the rivals who had waited years for a single stumble. They weren't looking at his art anymore, they were looking for the crack. He reached out to steady himself against a pedestal, his palm damp against the cold stone. For a fleeting second, his mask slipped. His breathing hitched, a shallow, jagged sound that seemed to roar in the sudden silence of his own mind. He saw Minho straighten, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the tremor in Kaisung's hands. The porcelain was breaking. Every lie he had told himself about his own invincibility was falling away, leaving only the raw, terrified boy beneath the suit. He forced his spine to straighten, a painful, mechanical movement, and swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He had to last 10 more minutes. 10 minutes of pretending the world wasn't dissolving into a blur of gray and gold. But as he caught his reflection in a nearby window, he didn't see the genius. He saw a man holding his own face together with nothing but pride and a fading prayer. The champagne was vintage, but it tasted like copper on Julian's tongue. He leaned against the mahogany railing of the mezzanine, watching the gala swirl below him. To the uninitiated, it was a celebration of the family's latest acquisition. To Julian, it was a feeding ground. He watched Moretti first. The man was a blunt instrument, usually loud and prone to posturing, but tonight he was huddled in a shadowed alcove with Vane and Costello. They weren't laughing. Their heads were bent low, a tight knot of hushed whispers and sharp, darting glances toward the head table where Julian's father sat, his grip on his cane trembling just slightly too much to be ignored. The weakness was out in the open now, a scent of blood in the water. "They aren't even trying to hide it anymore," a voice murmured beside him. It was Elena, her gaze fixed on the same trio. She didn't look at Julian, but he could see the tension in her jaw. "The coordination is too clean." Moretti handled the dock workers, Vane secured the transport routes, and Costello has been whispering in the ears of the council all night. They've spent the evening carving up the empire before the body is even cold. Julian took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes tracking a fourth man, a mid-level enforcer, moving toward the security hub at the back of the ballroom. The pieces were sliding into place with a sickening, rhythmic click. It wasn't just a grievance, it was a synchronized strike. "They think the transition won't happen," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. "They think the line ends with a sick old man and a son they view as a socialite." Down on the floor, Moretti caught Julian's eye. The sub-boss didn't look away this time. He raised his glass in a mock toast, a predatory smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. It was a declaration of war delivered over crystal and silk. The music swelled, a frantic, high-pitched violin arrangement, mimicking the rising pressure in Julian's chest. Across the room, the exits were being quietly manned by faces Julian didn't recognize as his own. The air grew heavy, the festive atmosphere curdling into something suffocating. The vultures weren't just circling anymore, they were landing, their talons out, waiting for the final light to flicker in his father's eyes. Julian set his glass on the railing, the chime of crystal on wood sounding like a starting pistol. The party was over. The hunt had begun. The smell of old paper and expensive scotch usually felt like power, but tonight, the air in her father's study felt like a tomb. Ha-Yol stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker while the man who had built their empire sat slumped behind the mahogany desk. For the first time in her life, he looked small. The prosecutors will be here by morning, she said, her voice a calm blade cutting through the silence. Her father didn't look up. His hands, once capable of crushing competitors with a single signature, trembled slightly as they gripped a crystal tumbler. I built this for you, Ha-Yul. Every sacrifice, every blurred line. It was for the family. Don't lie to me, father. Not tonight. She turned, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood as she approached the desk. She placed a single, slim manila envelope on the blotter. You didn't build this for me. You built it for your ego. But I'm the one left to decide if the name survives the fire. He reached for the envelope, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His face went ashen. It was a complete roadmap of his shell companies, the kickbacks, and the offshore accounts, evidence even his best lawyers couldn't bury. How did you get this? He whispered. I'm your daughter, she replied simply. I learned from the best. She leaned over the desk, her shadow falling across his face. This was the moment of mercy, though it tasted like ash. I'm offering you a choice. You can wait for the handcuffs, and we can watch the headlines tear this family apart piece by piece until there is nothing left but shame. Or, you can burn it down yourself. He looked up at her, confused. Burn it? Resign tonight. Cite your health. Transfer the voting shares to me and sign the confession I've drafted, the one that pins the liability on your CFO and the board members who enabled you. I'll ensure you retire to the villa in Jeju. You'll be a recluse, but you'll be a free man. You're asking me to give up everything, he rasped. I'm asking you to save your life, Ha-Yul countered, her voice softening just enough to show the ghost of the girl she used to be. The empire is already gone, father. I am just trying to save the man. She pushed a silver lighter across the desk. It caught the dim lamplight, a cold spark in the darkness. He looked at the lighter, then at the daughter who had finally outmaneuvered him. Slowly, his fingers closed around the cold metal. If I do this, he said, his voice breaking, will you come visit? Ha-Yul didn't answer immediately. She walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the brass knob. Sign the papers, father. Let's see what survives the night first. The transition from elegance to slaughter happened in the space of a single heartbeat. One moment, the ballroom was a sea of rhythmic silk and the low hum of polite laughter, the next, the heavy oak doors thundered shut with a finality that chilled the marrow. It began not with a shout, but with the rhythmic, metallic clatter of pikes hitting the marble floor. Lord Varick, standing atop the dais with a glass of vintage gold in hand, didn't even have time to scream before the first crossbow bolt took him in the throat. The wine spilled, dark and staining, indistinguishable from the blood that followed. To arms! Prince Kalen cried, his hand diving for a blade that wasn't there. Ceremonial dress allowed no steel. He looked instinctively to the perimeter, to the elite Crimson Guard who had sworn their lives to the crown. But the betrayal was silent and absolute. Instead of drawing their swords to defend the royal line, the guards, men Kalen had broken bread with only hours before, simply turned their backs. With practiced, haunting synchronicity, they marched toward the side exits. They didn't strike a single blow, they simply withdrew, leaving the vacuum of power to be filled by the masked insurgents pouring from the kitchens and the galleries above. The gala dissolved into a panicked, claustrophobic nightmare. The orchestra's frantic violins cut out as a cellist was swept off his chair. Screams replaced the music, echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. Without the guards to hold the line, the nobility became nothing more than gilded cattle. Kalen watched in frozen horror as the loyal Commander Vane paused at the threshold of the great hall. Vane didn't look back with guilt, he looked back with the cold, dead eyes of a man who had already been paid. He sheathed his sword, signaled his men, and vanished into the shadows of the corridor, leaving the doors to be barred from the outside. The first line of insurgents reached the center of the room. Their steel was dull, unpolished, and thirsty. The air, once thick with the scent of jasmine and expensive perfumes, turned metallic and heavy. There was no room to run, no way to negotiate. As the first chandeliers were shot down, plunging the screaming crowd into a flickering, amber twilight, Kalen realized the truth: this wasn't a coup intended to seize the throne. It was a harvest. The cane felt heavier than it ever had, the dark, polished wood vibrating with a rhythm that matched Kaisang's failing heartbeat. For decades, this length of timber had been a symbol of absolute authority, a scepter that commanded silence in the halls of power. Now, it was merely a tool, and Kaisang was a man running out of time. Dust motes danced in the shafts of moonlight piercing through the shattered windows of the estate. Behind him, he could hear the frantic, uneven breathing of his daughter, Hannah. She was the only thing he had left that wasn't tainted by the blood on his hands. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice a gravelly ghost of its former self. "Father, come with me," Hannah pleaded, her hand clutching his sleeve. "There's a way out through the gardens." Kaisang didn't turn. He could hear the heavy boots of the encroaching men, the metallic slide of blades being drawn from sheaths. They weren't coming for her, they were coming to settle the debt of a lifetime. If he moved with her, his shadow would only draw the fire. "The path is narrow, Hannah. I will widen it." As the first of the shadows rounded the corner, Kaisang stepped forward. He didn't stand with the rigid posture of a king, but with the grounded weight of an oak. The cane didn't just strike, it sang. With a fluid motion that defied his age, he swept the tip across the marble floor, the crack echoing like a gunshot. The lead pursuer stumbled, the wind knocked from him before he could even raise his weapon. He moved with a brutal, economic grace. Every strike was a redirection of energy, a legacy of violence honed over 50 years, now distilled into a single purpose. He wasn't fighting to win a war or secure a throne, he was fighting for a 10-second head start. The weight of the cane grew with every blow, pulling at his shoulder sockets, demanding a price from his weary bones. He felt a sharp sting in his side, a blade's graze, perhaps, but he pushed the sensation into the same cold cellar where he kept his regrets. "Go," he roared, the command breaking through the chaos. He watched from the corner of his eye as Hannah's silhouette vanished into the tree-line of the garden. The weight in his chest eased, even as the weight of the wood in his hand became unbearable. He planted the cane firmly on the ground, leaning his full stature against it as the circle of men closed in. He had used this weapon to build an empire of fear, but in its final act, it had served as a simple bridge to freedom. He smiled, a thin, tired expression, and waited for the end. The metallic tang of spent gunpowder hung heavy in the frigid air, mingling with the sickly sweet scent of iron that now stained the warehouse floor. Silence followed the screaming, a silence so absolute it felt heavy, pressing against Ha-Yol's eardrums like deep water. He stood motionless, his chest heaving, the weapon in his hand feeling like a leaden weight he no longer knew how to carry. He looked down at the ruin of the life he had once been forced to serve. The bodies were merely shadows in the dim, flickering light of the overhead industrial lamps. There was no triumph in the sight, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. The debt, carved into his skin through years of fear and forced loyalty, was finally settled in full. Kaisang was gone. There had been no cinematic goodbye, no final moment of absolution. He had simply vanished into the chaos of the night, a ghost returning to the fog, leaving Ha-Yol to stand as the sole witness to their shared carnage. For a moment, Ha-Yol felt the urge to call out his name, but the sound died in his throat. The bond that had tethered them, a fraying rope of survival and shared trauma, had snapped. Walking toward the heavy steel doors, Ha-Yol's boots clicked rhythmically against the concrete, the only sound in the tomb he had built. He pushed the doors open, and the night air hit him like a physical blow. It was biting and sharp, smelling of impending snow and city exhaust, but it was the cleanest air he had breathed in a decade. The Mafia's shadow, which had stretched over every sunrise and clouded every dream, began to recede. He walked past the perimeter fence, leaving the sirens in the distance to wail for a world he no longer belonged to. There were no eyes watching him from the dark corners of the alleyways, no hidden microphones, no looming threats of retribution. The hierarchy was shattered, the kings were dead. He reached the bridge overlooking the Han River, the black water reflecting the fractured neon of the Seoul skyline. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the burner phone that had been his lifeline and his leash, and let it slip from his fingers. It disappeared into the dark with a soft splash. Ha-yo leaned against the cold railing, his hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline finally ebbed away. He was a man with no name, no past he cared to claim, and a future that was a terrifying, blank canvas. He was tired, deeper than his bones, but for the first time, the weight on his shoulders wasn't someone else's sin. He was alone, and in that solitude, he was finally, irrevocably free.